Cashier paid for a poor mother's food. When the supermarket owner found out, his reaction surprised everyone. The rain poured down furiously, soaking Sarah's thin coat as she ran through the empty streets. Her breathing grew heavier with every step, the cold air filling her lungs as if they were freezing from the inside. In her arms, her youngest son Daniel clung to her neck, his muffled cries barely audible over the roar of the storm. Emma, her eldest daughter, barely 8 years old, ran beside her, gripping her mother's hand tightly. The wet pavement turned treacherous under her feet, but she couldn't stop. The icy wind slapped her face, and each gust made her body tremble. Sarah tried not to think about the pain in her muscles or the tears that threatened to spill from her eyes. Her mind was fixed on one thing: reaching the supermarket. She knew they couldn't stay home that night. The electricity and gas had been cut off, the apartment was cold and dark, and the little food left in the pantry wouldn't be enough to feed her children. Hunger had already started to show on Emma and Daniel's faces, and the thought tormented her. She had to do something, anything, to give them a decent meal that night, even though she knew her wallet barely held a few coins. In the distance, the fluorescent lights of the supermarket shone like a beacon in the darkness. Every step seemed to bring her closer, but also intensified the sense of desperation. Sarah clung to the hope that the few coins she carried would be enough to buy at least some bread, maybe a little milk to calm her children's hunger. They entered the supermarket as the automatic doors hissed shut behind them, cutting off the howling wind. The contrast to the outside was overwhelming. The warmth and light inside wrapped around them, offering a brief moment of respite. Sarah felt the trembling in her body ease, but only for a second. Reality remained unforgiving. She didn't have enough money. Daniel was still sobbing, his face buried in her shoulder. Emma, always strong and mature for her age, said nothing. She knew they shouldn't complain. She knew her mother was already doing everything she could. "Come on, Emma," Sarah said, trying to smile. There was no time to pause. She hurried through the aisles, choosing the most basic items she could afford: a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, a few pieces of fruit. The items felt heavy in her hands, not because of their weight, but because of the responsibility they carried. Each thing she picked up was a promise of hope for that night, but in her heart, she knew it wouldn't be enough. Her children's hunger would still be there, lurking. When they reached the checkout counter, Sarah found Matthew, a young cashier who seemed to be finishing his shift. He was distracted, moving the products across the conveyor belt, until their eyes met. His expression immediately changed. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the tremor in her hands, and the silent desperation consuming her. "That's 120 pesos, Matthew said softly, almost apologetically. Sarah began counting the coins she had stuffed into her pocket before leaving home. Her hands trembled as she did so, not just from the cold still lingering in her fingers, but also from the shame that overwhelmed her. She didn't have enough. She was short by 30 pesos. She tried to take a deep breath to stay calm, but it felt like everything was collapsing around her. "Please," she murmured, "could you take the fruit off? I don't have enough." Matthew watched as she tried to hold herself together. Something about her reminded him of his own mother, of those days when he had counted coins to buy the medicine his mother needed. The memory of those nights hit him hard. He couldn't let this woman leave with less than what her children needed. "Don't worry, it's fine," Matthew replied, his voice soft but firm. Sarah looked at him, confused. Her hands were still trembling as she held onto the fruit, ready to return it. "I told you not to worry," Matthew repeated, lowering his gaze as he quickly rang up the rest of the items. Instead of removing the fruit, he added the rest of the products. Without saying another word, he discreetly swiped his own card to cover the difference. Sarah could hardly believe what was happening. Her eyes filled with tears instantly, but she didn't know if it was from relief or utter exhaustion. She couldn't speak. She simply nodded in gratitude. Her lips moved, trying to form words, but all that came out was a whisper. "Thank you." With the groceries in her hands, she turned to leave the supermarket. Outside, the storm still raged, but this time, Sarah felt a little less burdened. Daniel's sobs had quieted, and Emma clung to her more tightly, understanding that tonight, although difficult, they would have something to eat. However, in the distance, a figure watched in silence. Frank, the supermarket manager, stood at the end of the aisle, his eyes fixed on Matthew and the transaction that had just taken place. Though he hadn't intervened, something in his gaze revealed that this hadn't gone unnoticed. Mr. Edwards' office was silent, only the faint ticking of the clock marking the passage of time. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside, everything was calm. Mr. Edwards sat in his leather chair, surrounded by papers and the supermarket's financial records. It was late, much later than his usual hours, but something was keeping him awake that night. The supermarket wasn't doing well. The opening of a new store nearby had cut into sales, and Mr. Edward, always meticulous, was reviewing every detail of the business. He wanted to make sure nothing slipped by him. He had spent years building this place from the ground up, with hard work and discipline. Success hadn't come easy, and that's why he always kept everything under tight control. That night, as part of his routine, he decided to review the day's security footage. It wasn't something he did often, but the unease in his chest pushed him not to trust anyone but himself. The cameras allowed him to stay on top of what was happening in the store, the attitudes of his employees, and the movements of the customers. As he fast-forwarded through the footage, he saw Matthew at the checkout counter. Everything seemed normal until something caught his attention. A woman, drenched with two small children, approached the register. Mr. Edward watched the screen more closely. The woman looked familiar, though he couldn't place exactly where from. He narrowed his eyes as he watched the interaction. Sarah placed some items on the conveyor belt and began counting coins. Matthew appeared calm, but then something changed. The woman asked him to remove an item, and Matthew, instead of doing so, performed a quick action. He rewound the footage to watch it more closely, and there it was. Matthew had paid the difference. Mr. Edwards stopped breathing for a second, surprised. What had Matthew done? Had he taken money from the register to cover a customer? His first instinct was anger. He didn't tolerate that kind of behavior in his store. Rules existed for a reason, and all employees knew they had to follow them. No one was allowed to manipulate the cash register. But then something made him pause. He decided to take a closer look at the woman's face. He zoomed in, examining every detail of her weary expression, the children beside her. And then he understood. That woman wasn't just anyone. She was the daughter of someone he had known very well, Elena. Elena had worked for him in the early days of the supermarket, a strong, dedicated woman who had never missed a day of work or failed to meet her responsibilities, despite the challenges she faced as a single mother. He had deeply respected Elena, but had never gotten involved beyond the employer-employee relationship. And now, all these years later, here was her daughter, Sarah, in clear need. Mr. Edwards' anger began to transform into a mix of guilt and sadness. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. All these years, he had witnessed people around him suffer, but he had never done enough to help them. He vaguely remembered how Elena had stopped working shortly before her death, and how he had never heard from her family again. His gaze returned to the screen. There was Elena's daughter, struggling to feed her children. What had happened to that family to bring them to this point? Why hadn't he been aware of it? Guilt hit him full force. Perhaps he had been too harsh, too focused on his business to care about those around him. Mr. Edward took a deep breath, trying to calm the wave of emotions overwhelming him. He had to do something. He couldn't sit idly by after seeing Sarah's situation. The decision was clear. The next morning he would speak to Matthew. He wanted to understand better what had happened, but deep down he already knew what he would do. He wouldn't punish Matthew for his act of kindness. On the contrary, he was grateful that someone in his store had enough compassion to help a mother in need. Mr. Edward, who had spent his whole life growing his business with strict rules, realized that for once he had to act from the heart, not the head. Moreover, he needed to right a wrong from the past. He hadn't done enough for Elena, but now he had the chance to help her daughter. He would offer Sarah a job in the bakery, a place she knew well, where she could have a steady income and hopefully get back on her feet. The soft click of the door closing behind Matthew echoed in Mr. Edwards' office. The young cashier stood nervously before his boss, his hands clasped together, feeling a weight in his chest. He wasn't exactly sure why Mr. Edward had asked to speak with him that morning, but part of him feared it was because of what had happened the night before. He had tried not to think about it, but the image of Frank watching the transaction still lingered in his mind. "Matthew, sit down," Mr. Edward said, his tone serious but not as cold as Matthew had expected. Matthew obeyed, unable to stop his mind from filling with negative thoughts. What if Mr. Edward had found out? What would he do if he got fired? He needed this job to support his mother, who was sick and depended on his salary for her medicine. Was it worth risking everything for that impulse to help Sarah? Mr. Edward observed him in silence, leaning back in his leather chair. He could see the unease in the young man's eyes, the nervousness in his posture. Matthew wasn't a bad kid. He had been working for him for a couple of years, always diligent, never causing problems. But what he had done the night before, paying for a customer's food, went against the rules. Anyone else in his position might have been fired, but Mr. Edward felt that he shouldn't act hastily. There was something deeper at play. "Matthew, last night I reviewed the security footage," Mr. Edward began, watching the immediate reaction on Matthew's face. The young man swallowed hard, but said nothing. "And I saw what you did for that woman, for Sarah." Matthew felt his stomach sink. He had been caught. But instead of getting angry, he prepared to face the consequences. If he was fired, at least he would know he had done the right thing. "Sir, he began, but Mr. Edward raised a hand, signaling him to wait. "Listen to me first, Matthew. I understand why you did it," Mr. Edward continued. "Most people wouldn't have bothered to look beyond the transaction, but you saw a mother desperate to feed her children, and you chose to act. I know you did it from the heart, and I appreciate your compassion. However, what you did was wrong from the store's policy standpoint." Matthew lowered his head, feeling each word sink him further. He knew he had broken the rules, but Sarah's needs at that moment outweighed any written policy. "I'm sure you thought this would cost you your job," Mr. Edward continued, "and maybe it would have in other circumstances, but there's something you need to know." The silence in the room stretched for what felt like an eternity. Mr. Edward took a deep breath before continuing. "I know Sarah. I knew her mother, Elena, who worked for me when I first opened this store years ago. She was a strong, hard-working woman. She raised her daughter on her own and always fought to give them the best. Seeing Sarah in the situation she's in now makes me feel like I failed Elena somehow. Maybe I should have done more for her when I had the chance." Matthew looked up, surprised. He hadn't expected this connection between his boss and the woman he had helped. Suddenly, everything made more sense, and something inside him relaxed, realizing that Mr. Edward wasn't angry, but emotionally affected by the situation. "Matthew," Mr. Edward said, "what you did wasn't right according to the business rules, but I can't punish you for helping someone in need. In fact, I think it's something we should all do more often. So, instead of reprimanding you, I've decided that I'm going to offer Sarah a job here in the bakery. We need to fill a position, and I know it could be an opportunity for her and her children." Matthew blinked, surprised. He had expected a reprimand, maybe even dismissal, but instead, Mr. Edward was willing to help Sarah in a more permanent way. "You're going to offer her a job?" Matthew asked, still processing the situation. "Yes," Mr. Edward confirmed. "I know about that family's situation, and I can't just stand by. If Elena were alive, I'm sure she would want the best for her daughter, and I believe this job can help Sarah stabilize. It's the least I can do." Matthew felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. What had started as a simple act of compassion had triggered a chain of events that now offered real hope for Sarah and her family. Not only that, but he also felt that for the first time Mr. Edward had seen him as more than just an employee. He had seen his humanity, his desire to help. "Thank you, sir," Matthew said sincerely. "Thank you for giving Sarah this opportunity. I know she needs it." Mr. Edward nodded, watching the young man for a few more seconds. He had made the right decision. Maybe he couldn't change the past or undo his mistakes, but he still had time to do the right thing now. And at that moment, he felt like he was starting to walk that path. "Matthew, I want you to be the one to talk to Sarah and offer her the job. It's important that she knows she's not alone, and that this store will always be a place where she can find support," Mr. Edwards said, standing up and extending his hand for a firm shake. Matthew stood up, surprised but grateful for the trust placed in him. As he left the office, he felt the weight he had carried all morning lift. He knew the conversation with Sarah wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he had news that could change her life. At least now there was hope. Sarah arrived early at the bakery in the supermarket, her hands still feeling the morning chill as she adjusted the white apron they had given her. She looked around, noticing the empty trays that would soon be filled with freshly baked bread. The aroma of the place was warm and comforting, but the knot in her stomach remained. She was grateful for the opportunity Matthew had given her, but she couldn't help feeling overwhelmed by the weight of what it meant. She had accepted the job immediately. She couldn't afford to hesitate, not with Emma and Daniel depending on her. Every day when she opened her eyes, Sarah felt the pressure of being the sole provider for her children. And though the bakery job gave her a little hope, reality remained unforgiving. It wasn't just about money. It was the constant worry for her children, the time she spent away from them, and the instability hanging over their lives. That morning, like every morning since she started at the bakery, Sarah had woken up before dawn. Emma and Daniel were still sound asleep when she got up. Despite the exhaustion, Sarah always tried to wake up with a smile, so as not to worry her children. She knew Emma, even at her young age, already understood too much. She couldn't fool her, but at least she wanted her to feel safe. While she prepared a quick breakfast for them, her mind was already on the store, thinking about the work ahead. "Mummy, will you work all day again today?" Emma had asked the night before as she helped her mother clean their small apartment kitchen. Sarah had felt a lump in her throat when she heard her daughter's question. It wasn't fair for Emma to have to worry about such things, but the situation left her with few options. She had pulled her daughter close and hugged her gently. "Yes, my love, but I'll be back before you know it," she replied, trying to sound cheerful, though inside she felt the guilt of leaving her children every day. Emma gave a weak smile, but Sarah could see the worry behind that smile. She knew her daughter was trying to be strong for her brother and for her. She was mature for her age, and that maturity broke Sarah's heart. No child should have to carry so much at such a young age. That morning, like every morning, Sarah had left Emma and Daniel with their neighbor, Mrs. Lydia, an older woman who lived in the same building. Lydia was kind, but Sarah knew she couldn't rely on her to take care of the kids long term. The situation was temporary, and each day that passed, Sarah's anxiety grew as she thought about how she could continue balancing work and raising her children. "Are you ready, Sarah?" Marta, one of the veteran bakers, asked, interrupting Sarah's thoughts. Sarah nodded, though the truth was she felt completely overwhelmed. Working in the bakery was much harder than she had imagined. The hours were long, and the physical work was demanding. Kneading dough, managing the oven, preparing trays. It was a constant effort. Though she didn't complain, in her heart, she felt like her body wouldn't be able to keep up with this pace for long. Marta showed her how to prepare the dough for the day's bread, her movements precise and quick. Sarah tried to follow her example but felt clumsy at first. Her hands, used to other tasks, seemed awkward as she tried to imitate Marta's skill. "Don't worry, it's normal to struggle at first, but you'll get the hang of it soon," Marta said with a reassuring smile. "We all started the same way." Sarah smiled, grateful for her co-worker's patience, but inside, her mind was elsewhere. As she kneaded the dough, her thoughts always returned to Emma and Daniel. Would they be okay with Mrs. Lydia? Had they eaten enough breakfast? And what would happen if Emma needed something and she wasn't there? Emma, although only 8 years old, had taken on an almost adult role. She helped her mother in any way she could, took care of her brother, and handled some of the household chores. Sarah was proud of her daughter, but also deeply saddened. No child should have to take on so many responsibilities. On the other hand, Daniel, smaller and more sensitive, was becoming increasingly affected by the changes. His nightmares had become more frequent, and he often woke up in the middle of the night crying, calling for his mother. "Mama, don't go," Daniel had said that very morning, his eyes still heavy with sleep as he watched her leave. Sarah had tried to comfort him, kissing him on the forehead and promising him she'd be back soon. But as she said it, She knew her promise was fragile. The work at the bakery was tough and the hours endless. Every day seemed like a new challenge just to stay afloat. "Sarah, focus on the dough, not on your thoughts," Marta said, gently tapping her shoulder. Sarah realized she had been kneading too hard, almost as if trying to vent her frustration through the dough. She eased her movements and took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't afford to fail at this job. She had no other choice. Her children depended on her, and this job, although exhausting, was giving them some stability, something they hadn't had in a long time. The hours at the bakery passed slowly, but Sarah put her heart into every task, wanting to prove she could handle it. As the day went on, she grew more tired but kept pushing forward. Every loaf of bread she placed on the shelves made her feel like she was one step closer to giving her children a better life, even if it was a small step. Finally, at the end of the day, as the sun began to set and the supermarket started to empty, Sarah felt she could take a brief moment of rest. She leaned against the counter, looking at the rows of bread she had helped prepare. She was exhausted, but also satisfied that she had made it through another day. But the peace was short-lived. She knew she still had a long walk back home, where more responsibilities awaited her. Although the bakery work was done, her duties as a mother were just beginning. As she left the supermarket, the worry about Emma and Daniel returned to her mind. How long could she keep balancing everything? How much longer before she broke under the pressure? Lauren looked at the supermarket from the parking lot. She had spent years studying business administration abroad, preparing for the day she would take over the family business, but upon returning, she found herself facing a bigger challenge than expected. Her father's supermarket, Mr. Edward's Pride, wasn't doing well. The new chains of modern supermarkets with competitive prices had cut into their sales, and now the store she loved was at risk. She sighed before stepping inside, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. She knew working alongside her father wouldn't be easy. He had a very traditional way of running the business. However, Lauren was determined to prove that her modern ideas and more human approach could be what they needed to survive in a changing market. As she walked through the automatic doors, the warmth of the place and the everyday hum of customers greeted her. Despite the sales not being what they used to be, Lauren still saw the supermarket as the heart of the community. Many people in the neighborhood depended on it, not just for groceries, but as a place to meet, a space where everyone knew each other. Lauren made her way to her father's office, observing the details around her. The store needed an urgent renovation. The shelves looked outdated, the lighting was too cold, and there was a clear disconnect between the store and the current needs of its customers. Lauren already had some ideas in mind to modernize the space and attract new clients, but she knew her father wouldn't be easily convinced. "Lauren, my dear, I'm glad you're here," Mr. Edward said when he saw her enter the office. His face lit up with a mix of pride and affection. "I know things aren't easy right now, but with your help, I'm confident we'll turn this around." "Dad, I've been looking at some things, and I think we can make improvements that will draw more people in. But it's not just about remodeling the store. We need to reconnect with the community, be that place people trust again," Lauren responded, her tone firm but calm. Mr. Edward nodded, though his expression showed slight resistance. He had always been a strict businessman, and while he trusted his daughter's abilities, he wasn't fully convinced that her modern ideas were the solution. "I want to observe how everything works first, see the employees, the customers, and then I'll give you a detailed plan," Lauren continued, seeing that her father still had doubts. "All right, daughter, do what you think is necessary, but remember this supermarket has been here for decades. It has survived many challenges and will continue standing," Mr. Edward said, his tone a mix of pride and caution. Lauren smiled slightly, understanding that earning her father's full trust wouldn't happen overnight. She left the office and began walking through the store. She watched the employees closely, studied their interactions with customers, and analyzed every detail, from the products to the checkout service. That's when she saw him for the first time. Matthew, the young cashier who had helped Sarah the night before, was at his station, working with an efficiency that caught her attention. Lauren paused, watching how Matthew interacted with customers. There was something about him that intrigued her. It wasn't just his professionalism, but also his ability to connect with people. Even though the cashier job could become monotonous, Matthew maintained a positive attitude and a genuine smile that the customers seemed to appreciate. As she observed him, Lauren remembered what her father had told her about Matthew. He had mentioned how the young man had helped a mother in need, covering the cost of her groceries without hesitation. Lauren couldn't help but feel respect for someone like that. It was that kind of attitude she wanted to foster in the store: empathy, humanity, and a true desire to help the community. "Matthew, right?" Lauren asked when she had the chance to approach him. Matthew looked up from his register, surprised to see the owner's daughter speaking to him directly. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you with something?" he replied with a friendly smile, though a bit nervous. "My father told me about you, about what you did for that woman last night," Lauren said, with admiration in her voice. Matthew blinked, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I just tried to help. It wasn't a big deal," he replied, downplaying it. "It was a big deal. Not everyone would have done what you did. It takes courage to break the rules for something you know is right," Lauren responded with a warm smile. Matthew didn't know what to say. He hadn't expected praise for something that, in his mind, was simply the right thing to do. "Well, I guess in moments like that you just have to follow your heart," he said finally, shrugging. Lauren nodded, impressed. At that moment, she decided that Matthew could be important for the changes she wanted to implement. If there were more employees like him, people who saw beyond transactions and cared about the well-being of customers, the supermarket wouldn't just survive. It would thrive. "I'll be observing the store for a while, looking at ways we can improve things. I'd love to hear your ideas too. Sometimes those on the front lines have the best solutions," Lauren said, giving Matthew a chance to participate in the changes. Matthew nodded, surprised by the offer. He wasn't used to managers or owners asking for someone in his position's opinion, but Lauren seemed sincere. "Of course, I'd be happy to help in any way I can," he replied with a smile, starting to feel more at ease. As Lauren continued her tour of the store, her thoughts kept returning to Matthew. She knew she would need more people like him if she wanted the supermarket to survive. At the same time, she couldn't help but feel a growing admiration for his dedication and ethics. There was something about him, a drive, a desire to do the right thing, that resonated with her own ideals of what the business should be. But not everyone shared that opinion. Frank, the manager, had been watching from a distance. For years, he had worked closely with Mr. Edward, climbing the ranks of the store, hoping to one day take on a more prominent role. Lauren's arrival and her growing interest in Matthew didn't sit well with him. He felt his position was being threatened, and that he wasn't willing to allow. Frank watched from his office as Lauren moved through the store, stopping occasionally to talk to employees. Something about her proactive attitude, the fresh ideas she shared, and especially the attention she was giving to Matthew irritated him deeply. After years of working under Mr. Edward, rising step by step, Frank had always thought he would one day take over the store. But now, with Lauren back and showing interest in someone like Matthew, his ambitions were in jeopardy. Matthew was nothing more than a simple cashier. A good kid, perhaps, but nothing more. Why was Lauren looking at him with such interest? Frank had convinced himself that Matthew was putting everything he had built in the store at risk. He wasn't going to let someone so young, with so little experience, win the favor of Lauren and Mr. Edward. As he pondered his next move, Frank began to think about how he could eliminate Matthew from the equation. He needed a plan to discredit him and, in the process, reinforce his own importance within the supermarket. He knew Matthew had helped Sarah the other night, something that technically went against store policy, and then it hit him. Sarah was vulnerable, a single mother struggling to stay afloat, new to the store, and grateful for any help she could get. Frank knew he could use that vulnerability to manipulate her. If he played his cards right, he could convince her that her only way out was to cooperate with him, and with Sarah on his side, he could create the perfect situation to discredit Matthew. Later that day, when the bakery was almost empty and Sarah was working alone, Frank saw his opportunity. He approached her with a calculated smile. "Sarah, how's everything going with your new job?" he asked, feigning genuine interest. Sarah, always polite, smiled tiredly as she continued placing loaves of bread on the shelves. "It's going well, thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity, she replied, though her exhaustion was evident. Frank nodded, watching her tired face. He knew it wouldn't be hard to manipulate her. I know this job is tough, especially for a mother who's alone taking care of her kids, Frank continued. And I can imagine that balancing everything, the work here and caring for Emma and Daniel, isn't easy. Sarah looked up, a bit surprised that Frank knew her children's names. She hadn't spoken much with him, but it seemed like he was just trying to be kind. Still, his comment hit a sensitive spot. It hadn't been easy, and what Frank said was true. It's difficult, but I do it for my kids, Sarah replied, her voice a bit tense. She didn't like talking about her problems with strangers, but the situation forced her to accept any support, even if it was just a conversation. Frank, seeing he had opened a small door in the conversation, decided to push further. Look, Sarah, I'm aware of what Matthew did for you the other night, he said confidentially, stepping a little closer. I don't want to meddle in your business, but it wasn't exactly a smart decision on his part. It was a risk, you know. The store's rules are clear, and what he did could have cost him his job. Sarah felt a chill at the mention of Matthew. She had been grateful for what he had done, but she also knew it had been a risky gesture. Had they found out? Was he in trouble for helping her? I didn't know that could cost him his job, she murmured, worried. Frank leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. That's why I'm telling you this, Sarah. I don't want anyone here to suffer the consequences of a bad decision, especially you, who's just starting. I could help make things a bit easier for you. Maybe you could get a more flexible schedule or even an advance to make things more manageable with your kids. Sarah looked at him, incredulous. An advance? A flexible schedule? She knew the store wasn't in a position to offer such concessions, but the idea of having a little extra money for her kids, or even being able to spend more time with them, was tempting. What do you want? Sarah asked cautiously, sensing there was more to Frank's offer. Frank smiled, satisfied that he had caught her attention. Just a little help from you. Maybe you could keep an eye on Matthew. You know, make sure he doesn't make any more mistakes like the one the other night. If you see something that's not right, let me know. And in return, I'll make sure things get better for you here. Sarah remained silent, feeling something wasn't right. She wasn't stupid. She knew that what Frank was asking her to do was essentially to betray the person who had helped her at her lowest point. But what could she do? She was exhausted with no clear options. Emma and Daniel depended on her, and the possibility of a more flexible schedule or an advance to cover some debts was hard to ignore. Frank, seeing the indecision on her face, decided to press a little more. Think about it, Sarah. You don't have to decide now. I just want to help. But if we don't do something, Matthew could end up in even bigger trouble. And trust me, in that case, you'd be affected too. Sarah nodded slowly, unable to respond at that moment. Frank gave her one last smile before turning and walking away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. That night, as she tried to fall asleep, Frank's proposal kept echoing in Sarah's mind. She felt trapped between two worlds. On one hand, she knew she couldn't betray Matthew, who had been her savior in her darkest moment. But on the other hand, the promise of a slightly easier life for her children, with less stress and worry, was tempting. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of Emma and Daniel, dependent on her for everything. The day had been long and exhausting, but the weight of Frank's proposal made Sarah's night even harder. She had tossed and turned in bed, trapped between guilt and desperation. The faces of Emma and Daniel kept appearing in her mind, reminding her of how vulnerable their situation was. On one side, Frank's promise of a flexible schedule and an advance was a tempting opportunity, but the betrayal he was asking her to commit against Matthew was tearing her apart inside. Matthew had been the only one to help her when she needed it most. He had risked his job for her and her children. Now the thought of betraying him made her feel like a horrible person. Yet the fear of not being able to properly care for Emma and Daniel made her hesitate. Finally, before the sun rose, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't betray Matthew. No matter how difficult her situation was, she couldn't sell her integrity. She knew she had to talk to him, confess what Frank had proposed, and together find a way to face the situation. That morning, Sarah arrived at the supermarket earlier than usual. There was still time before her shift at the bakery began, but she needed to find Matthew. She had to talk to him before Frank took his next step. As she walked through the empty aisles of the store, the silence around her only heightened the anxiety in her chest. She didn't know how Matthew would react, but she had to trust that he would understand. When she reached the checkout area, she saw Matthew at his station, adjusting the machine and getting ready for his shift. He seemed focused, unaware of the conflict brewing behind the scenes. Sarah felt a knot in her stomach as she thought about what she was about to do, but she knew she had no other choice. "Matthew, can we talk for a moment?" Sarah said, her voice low, trying not to draw attention. Matthew looked up, surprised by her tone. He saw the tension on her face and knew immediately that something was wrong. He removed his earpiece and nodded. "Of course, Sarah, what's going on?" he replied, stepping away from the counter and guiding her to a more private corner, away from the security cameras and prying ears. Sarah took a deep breath, searching for the right words to explain what had happened, without feeling like a traitor. "Matthew, something happened yesterday. Frank approached me," she began, her eyes fixed on the floor. "He made me an offer." Matthew watched her, his expression calm but alert. He said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "He offered me an advance and a more flexible schedule, something I really need to take care of my kids," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she remembered the proposal. "But he asked for something in return." Matthew frowned, knowing what was coming wouldn't be good. But instead of interrupting, he let her continue. "He asked me to watch you, to find something you could do wrong and tell him, so he could discredit you in front of Mr. Edward," she finally confessed, feeling the weight of guilt on her shoulders. "He wanted me to betray you, but I can't do it, Matthew. I can't betray you after what you did for me and my kids." Matthew remained silent for a moment, processing what he had just heard. He wasn't surprised by Frank's actions. He knew the manager saw him as a threat and would try anything to protect his position in the store. But hearing that Frank had tried to manipulate Sarah, someone Matthew deeply respected for her strength and sacrifice, infuriated him. However, Matthew didn't let his anger cloud his judgment. He looked at Sarah, who seemed on the verge of tears, and stepped closer to place a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, what you did by coming here to tell me shows that you're an incredible person. I know your situation is difficult for you and your kids, and Frank knows that too. That's why he tried to take advantage of you," Matthew said, keeping his voice gentle but firm. "Don't feel guilty. You're not the one to blame here. Frank is the one acting wrong." Sarah felt immediate relief at hearing his words, though the situation was still complicated. "I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped. My kids need so much, and when he made that offer, for a moment I thought about accepting it. But I couldn't do it," Sarah said, her voice breaking. Matthew nodded, understanding the desperation that had brought her to that point. "I understand, Sarah. You'll do anything for your kids, and that makes you an amazing mother. But we can't let Frank keep manipulating people like this. We have to confront him, and we'll do it together," Matthew said, his gaze determined. Sarah looked at him, surprised by Matthew's calmness and determination. She had feared her confession might destroy the trust between them, but instead, she felt the bond had strengthened. She wasn't alone in this fight. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, still uncertain about how to face someone as powerful as Frank. Matthew remained silent for a moment, thinking about what lay ahead. He knew that confronting Frank wouldn't be easy, but he also knew they couldn't allow him to continue abusing his power. Then, he made a decision. "First, we need to gather proof of what Frank is doing. We can't just approach Mr. Edward without something solid. I also know that Lauren, Mr. Edward's daughter, is suspicious of Frank. She can help us, but we need to be prepared. If we can show that Frank is manipulating employees and jeopardizing the store's well-being, Mr. Edward will have no choice but to act," Matthew explained. Sarah nodded slowly. She was afraid of what was to come, but trusting Matthew gave her a glimmer of hope. "Don't worry, Sarah, we'll solve this. Frank can't keep acting as if he can do whatever he wants without consequences," Matthew added, resolute. For the first time in days, Sarah felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had feared this situation would crush her, but with Matthew by her side, she felt capable of facing anything. The tension in the supermarket was palpable. Even though the day had begun like any other, Matthew and Sarah knew that the moment to act was approaching. The air was thick with a mix of anxiety and determination as they devised their plan to expose Frank. They couldn't confront him without evidence, and they knew that any misstep could leave them in an even more vulnerable position. Matthew, while determined, couldn't shake the pressure. He knew Frank was cunning, and any wrong move could mean not only the end of his job, but also a devastating blow to Sarah. This wasn't just a workplace conflict. It was a battle for the well-being of people he cared about. And at the heart of that battle was Sarah, fighting for her family. "We need to be very careful," Matthew whispered, as he and Sarah stood in a corner of the storage room, away from cameras and prying ears. "Frank has the power to twist things in his favor if we don't handle this right." Sarah nodded, nervous but determined. She had faced many challenges in her life, but this situation had her on the edge. She knew that her children's well-being depended on everything going right, and that responsibility pushed her to act with a bravery she didn't know she had. "Where do we start?" Sarah asked, wanting to be as prepared as possible. Matthew had spent all night thinking of a plan, reviewing Frank's movements, suspicious behaviors, and how he handled the employees. He had seen things over the years that he never thought to question, but now he knew he had to watch with new eyes. "First, we need proof of how he manipulates employees and whether he's doing anything shady with the store's finances," Matthew replied. "Lauren will also be key. I've noticed she doesn't trust Frank as much as her father does, and if we can get her on board, we'll have more support to present the evidence." The mention of Lauren made Sarah feel a little more at ease. If someone like Lauren, Mr. Edward's daughter, was on their side, things might turn in their favor. Besides, Lauren seemed like a fair woman, committed to modernizing the store and improving the environment for employees. "And how do we involve her?" Sarah asked, knowing that any wrong move could tip Frank off. "Lauren's been reviewing the store's financial records since she got here. If there's anything wrong, she's likely already noticed or suspects something. We have to approach her carefully. But if we show her how Frank is manipulating the employees, she can help us dig deeper," Matthew explained. Sarah nodded, though the idea of involving Lauren, someone with so much power in the store, made her nervous. "Do you think she'll believe us?" Sarah asked, a hint of doubt in her voice. Matthew looked at her with determination. "I have no doubt. Lauren already distrusts Frank. She just needs the missing piece to take action, and we can give her that piece," he replied confidently. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The plan was starting to take shape in her mind, but there was still so much to do. She knew that exposing Frank wouldn't be easy. He had been at the store for years, earning Mr. Edward's trust, and he was clever. But Matthew was right. If they played their cards right, they could come out on top. The first step of the plan was to closely observe Frank's behavior. Sarah knew her interaction with Frank had only been a small sample of what he was probably doing to other employees. Matthew, meanwhile, decided to stay alert to any irregularities in the store's operations, especially in the finances. If they could catch Frank manipulating the records or coercing other employees, they would have solid evidence to present to Mr. Edward and Lauren. That same day, Sarah watched Frank more closely. She noticed how he approached other employees, always with a friendly but calculated smile. It was clear his goal was to maintain control, using his position to ensure no one dared question his actions. Every time Sarah saw Frank interact with others, she wondered how many had fallen under his manipulations. Matthew, for his part, focused on the numbers. From his position at the register, he had access to sales records and small details that would normally go unnoticed. There were rumors among some employees that certain products weren't being properly logged or that the sales figures didn't add up. Lauren, when reviewing the financial reports, had already noticed some discrepancies, but now Matthew had the task of gathering more information and comparing it to what he saw day by day in the store. One afternoon, while Lauren was reviewing some papers in her office, Matthew decided it was time to speak with her. He gathered his courage and knocked softly on the door. "Lauren, do you have a minute?" he asked, hoping she wasn't too busy. Lauren looked up, surprised to see Matthew, but nodded. "Of course, Matthew. What's going on?" she replied, setting her papers aside. Matthew entered the office and closed the door behind him. He knew that what he was about to say could change everything, but he also knew there was no turning back. They had to act. I've noticed some strange things going on in the store, and I think Frank isn't being completely honest about what's happening here, Matthew began, choosing his words carefully. Lauren watched him with interest, her expression serious but attentive. What exactly do you mean? She asked, leaning forward. Matthew explained what he had seen and heard, how Frank was manipulating the employees, and how he had coerced Sarah. He also mentioned the suspicions about the financial records and the discrepancies he had noticed in sales. As he spoke, Lauren listened intently, her face growing more stern as she understood the gravity of what Matthew was saying. I'd already suspected something was wrong with the finances, but this goes further, Lauren said after a moment of reflection. Frank has been with us for many years, but if what you're saying is true, we can't let him keep manipulating the employees and harming the business. Matthew nodded, relieved that Lauren was taking him seriously. He knew having her on their side was crucial to exposing Frank and making Mr. Edwards see the truth. We need proof, Lauren. We can't go to your father with just suspicions, Matthew said. If we can show that Frank is manipulating others and skimming from the store, he won't have a leg to stand on. Lauren agreed. She knew that although her father trusted Frank implicitly, the evidence would be key to exposing him. Together, Matthew and Lauren began planning how they could gather that evidence without Frank catching on. Matthew, Sarah, and Lauren were more united than ever in their mission to expose Frank. They knew they had to act quickly and precisely before he suspected anything. The plan they had devised was simple but effective. Provoke Frank into making a mistake that they could document and use as definitive proof. Frank, though confident in his position within the supermarket, was beginning to notice subtle changes in the employees' behavior. It was a faint feeling, but his instincts told him something was going on. He didn't know exactly what, but his suspicion of Matthew grew with each passing day. He decided it was time to tighten his control, especially over Sarah, who remained a weak link for manipulation. "Sarah, can you come to my office for a moment?" Frank said one morning, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sarah felt a wave of nerves as she heard him. She knew this was part of the plan, but that didn't make the situation any less unsettling. She took a deep breath and followed Frank to his office. As she entered, the atmosphere felt heavy, as if every word and movement were loaded with tension. She knew she had to play her cards right and pretend she was still undecided about Frank's proposal. "I've been thinking about our last conversation, Sarah," Frank said as he sat behind his desk, clasping his hands. "I know you have a lot to think about with your kids and everything going on, and I want to help you. You know I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things easier for you." Sarah nodded slowly, feigning nervousness as she fiddled with the edges of her apron. She knew she had to be convincing. Part of the plan was to make Frank feel confident that she might give in. "I know, Frank, and I appreciate it. It's just that I don't know if I can do what you're asking. Matthew has helped me so much, and I don't want to betray him," Sarah said, using the exact words they knew would provoke Frank to push harder. Frank's smile faded slightly, but was quickly replaced by a more serious expression. "Sarah, you need to understand something," he said, leaning forward with a more severe tone. "Matthew is putting his job at risk with everything he's doing. If we don't keep an eye on him, not only will he get hurt, but you could too. I'm offering you a chance to be on the right side when everything falls apart." That was the moment Matthew and Lauren had been waiting for. Matthew had placed a small recording device, provided by Lauren, on Sarah's clothing before the meeting. Everything Frank was saying was being captured. Now they needed him to confess something more direct. "But what if Matthew keeps doing his job well?" Sarah asked, continuing with the strategy. "I don't want to hurt him unless it's necessary." Frank, already irritated by Sarah's resistance, let out a short, bitter laugh. "Look, Sarah, everyone makes mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes need to be exposed. If Matthew makes one, even a small one, we can make it seem much bigger than it is. That's how things work here," Frank said, revealing his plan without a second thought. Sarah felt her heart race. They had done it. Frank had just admitted he was willing to manipulate the situation to get rid of Matthew. Now they had the proof they needed. "I understand," Sarah said in a submissive tone, keeping up her role as Frank smiled in satisfaction. "That's better. Don't worry, Sarah. This is what's best for everyone," Frank said, convinced he had everything under control. You'll see soon enough that you made the right decision." Sarah left the office, her heart pounding. They had what they needed, but now the challenge was to get the recording to Mr. Edward and make sure he and Lauren heard it before Frank realized what they had done. Matthew was waiting for her in the storage room, where they had agreed to meet after the conversation. When he saw her, he quickly approached. "Do you have it?" Matthew asked, hope shining in his eyes. Sarah nodded, showing him the small recording device hidden in her clothing. "He said it all, Matthew. He's willing to manipulate anything to frame you. Now we have the proof we need," Sarah said, feeling a mix of relief and fear. Matthew exhaled in relief, but he knew they couldn't relax yet. Now that they had the recording, they had to get it to Lauren and Mr. Edward without Frank finding out. If Frank started to suspect, he could move quickly to cover his tracks. That afternoon, Matthew and Sarah went to Lauren's office. They knew Lauren would be key in presenting the evidence to her father effectively. Lauren greeted them with seriousness, knowing that any misstep could compromise everything. "Did you get it?" Lauren asked as soon as they closed the office door. Matthew nodded and handed her the device. "Frank admitted everything. He's willing to manipulate any mistake to get me out of the way, and he even hinted that he's done the same with other employees," Matthew explained. Lauren inserted the device into her computer and began listening to the recording. As Frank's voice filled the room, her expression hardened. She had always suspected something dark about Frank, but hearing the direct proof was something else entirely. "This is more than enough," Lauren finally said, clenching her fists. "With this, my father will have no choice but to act. Frank hasn't just manipulated the employees, he's endangered the family business." Matthew and Sarah exchanged a glance, feeling like the first major battle had been won. But they knew the confrontation with Frank wasn't over yet. What came next was presenting the evidence to Mr. Edward, someone who had trusted Frank for years. It wouldn't be easy for him to accept that his trusted manager had betrayed him this way. "I'm going to speak to my father tonight. This can't wait," Lauren said with determination. "But I want both of you to be there. He needs to hear your testimonies too." Matthew and Sarah nodded, knowing the moment of truth was drawing near. If everything went as they hoped, Frank would finally be exposed, and things at the supermarket could change for the better. Night had fallen over the supermarket when Lauren, Matthew and Sarah gathered in Mr. Edward's office. The air was thick with tension, and the silence felt heavier than usual. They knew that what they were about to do could change everyone's fate, but the uncertainty about how Mr. Edward would react kept them on edge. He was a firm man, a leader who had run his business with a strict hand for decades. He trusted Frank implicitly, someone who had been his manager for many years. Lauren had decided not to wait any longer. They had the proof they needed, and while Frank's betrayal would be a hard blow for her father, she knew it was necessary. If they didn't act now, Frank could continue manipulating and hurting the family business. "Dad, we need to talk," Lauren said as she entered Mr. Edward's office. Her tone was firm but not aggressive. She knew the upcoming conversation wouldn't be easy. Mr. Edward looked up from some papers he had been reviewing. Seeing Lauren enter with Matthew and Sarah, he immediately sensed that something serious was going on. It wasn't common to see them together, especially in his office at this hour. He closed the folder in front of him and adjusted himself in his chair. "What's going on, daughter?" he asked, a mix of curiosity and concern in his voice. "It's about Frank," Lauren said, and she immediately noticed how her father's expression changed. Just the mention of Frank's name was enough to tense the atmosphere. Mr. Edward frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "What about Frank? He's been my trusted manager for years. Why are you bringing him up?" he asked defensively. Lauren took a deep breath and approached her father's desk, placing the small recording device in front of him. "Dad, Frank has been manipulating the employees. Using his position to coerce others, he's tried to frame Matthew and has threatened Sarah. This isn't just a suspicion, we have proof of his actions," Lauren said, keeping her composure. Mr. Edward looked at her in disbelief. The idea that Frank, someone he had trusted for so long, could be betraying him was hard to accept. But the seriousness in his daughter's face, along with the presence of Matthew and Sarah, made him realize this wasn't a light accusation. "What proof do you have?" he asked, his tone more severe. He didn't want to believe it, but he knew he had to listen. Lauren pressed the play button on the recording device, and Frank's voice filled the office. The words they heard were devastating. Frank spoke openly about how he was willing to manipulate any mistake Matthew made to get him out of the store, and how he had coerced Sarah into keeping an eye on him. Frank's confident, unscrupulous voice left no room for doubt about his intentions. As the recording continued, Mr. Edwards' face shifted from disbelief to shock. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Frank, the man he had considered an extension of himself in the store, was speaking as if his only priority was his own gain. It was a betrayal Mr. Edward had never seen coming. When the recording finished, the silence in the office was overwhelming. Mr. Edward didn't know what to say. He felt a mix of anger, pain, and disappointment. For years he had trusted Frank, giving him the power to manage the supermarket. But now he clearly saw how that trust had been abused. "Dad," Lauren said softly, breaking the silence, "I know this is hard to accept, but we can't allow Frank to stay in his position. He's been hurting the store, the employees, and our family." Mr. Edward took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment as he processed everything he had just heard. When he opened them again, he looked at Matthew and Sarah. "Why didn't you come to me earlier?" he asked, not with anger but with hurt. Matthew, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Sir, we didn't want to cause you trouble without solid proof. Frank has a lot of influence in the store, and we knew it wouldn't be easy to expose him. But we also knew that if we didn't act, he'd keep manipulating the employees and hurting the business," Matthew explained sincerely. Sarah nodded, feeling it was her turn to speak. "Frank offered me things to betray Matthew, and when I refused, he pressured me. I couldn't let him keep doing this. I felt trapped, but Matthew gave me the courage to stand up and do the right thing," Sarah added, her voice shaky but firm. Mr. Edward listened in silence, feeling the weight of each word. He knew they weren't to blame. The responsibility lay squarely on Frank, who had been manipulating everything behind his back. Finally, Mr. Edward stood up from his chair, his eyes hard and a look of determination on his face. "Frank has betrayed my trust, and he's done it at the expense of this store and the people who work here," he said, his voice full of contained indignation. "I won't allow him to work for me another day." Matthew, Lauren, and Sarah exchanged looks of relief, knowing they had taken the first big step. But they knew the confrontation with Frank wouldn't be easy. "What are you going to do?" Lauren asked, worried about what would come next. "I'm going to talk to him right now," Mr. Edward said with resolve. "Frank will have to answer for what he's done." The next day, Mr. Edward walked with firm steps down the supermarket aisles, his face reflecting a contained fury that few had ever seen. The employees watched him pass in astonishment, but no one dared approach. The atmosphere was tense, and everyone knew something important was about to happen. Frank was in his office, going through some papers, when the door suddenly burst open. Mr. Edward entered without waiting to be invited, his eyes locked on his manager. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed in the small space, as if signaling the end of everything Frank had built. "Mr. Edward, I wasn't expecting to see you so late," Frank said, surprised, but quickly regaining his usual composure. He knew something was wrong, but still didn't grasp the magnitude of the storm about to break. Mr. Edward wasted no time. Without preamble, he placed the recording device on Frank's desk. "Listen to this, Frank. Then tell me what you have to say in your defense," he ordered, his tone unforgiving. Frank, confused, looked at the device. It didn't take long for him to understand what was happening. He knew everything he had said to Sarah was recorded, and with it, his entire plan to manipulate Matthew and the employees was exposed. A cold sweat ran down his back, but he tried to stay calm. He pressed the play button, and as he listened to his own voice, his mind raced. He knew he was in a dangerous position, but he wasn't going down without a fight. "Mr. Edward, I think you're misunderstanding this," Frank said with a nervous smile. "What you heard is part of a conversation taken out of context. I was trying to protect the store. Matthew has made mistakes, and Sarah has been in difficult situations. What I was doing was making sure everything was under control." Mr. Edward watched him, his gaze sharp as a blade. He could see through Frank's lies, and at that moment, any doubt he had was gone. "Out of context," Mr. Edward repeated sarcastically. "You've been manipulating my employees, diverting attention from the real issues, and doing whatever it takes to maintain your power here. You've betrayed the trust I've given you for years." Frank realized his excuse hadn't worked. He quickly changed tactics, trying to appeal to the loyalty he had always shown Mr. Edward. "Mr. Edward, listen to me. Everything I've done has been for the good of this store. You and I have worked together for years. I know this looks bad, but I've been here since the beginning. I've protected this business when no one else did. You can't let a misunderstanding lead you to make a rash decision," he said, his tone now desperate. But Mr. Edward wasn't swayed. He had heard everything, and what hurt the most was that he had blindly trusted someone who had only worked for his own benefit. "This isn't a misunderstanding, Frank. This is over," Mr. Edward said with a firmness that left no room for argument. "From this moment on, you're fired, and I assure you, you won't get away with this easily. You will have to answer for what you've done." When Frank heard the word fired, he felt the ground beneath his feet crumble. He had underestimated Mr. Edward, and now he was paying dearly for it. He tried to maintain his composure, but anger began to take over him. "Fired?" he repeated incredulously. "After everything I've done for this store, you're going to fire me. All this time, I've been the one keeping this place running while you—" He stopped himself, realizing he was losing control. Mr. Edward remained silent, watching as Frank tried to justify himself. There was nothing more to say. Frank had dug his own grave. "I want you to leave now," Mr. Edward said, his voice cold and final. "There's nothing more to discuss." Frank, defeated but still full of rage, slowly stood from his chair. He looked at Mr. Edward with hatred, knowing he had lost. But before leaving, he couldn't resist throwing out one last threat. "You'll regret this, Mr. Edward. No one in this supermarket is ready for what's coming. Not you, not Lauren, not that fool Matthew. You'll see everything fall apart when I'm no longer here to keep things in order," Frank said, venom in every word. Mr. Edward didn't blink. "Leave, Frank. Your time here is over." Frank walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing through the aisles as the employees watched him. They knew something important had happened, but they didn't dare ask. Frank, once so powerful and feared, now seemed insignificant as he walked away from the place he had controlled with an iron fist for years. Lauren, Matthew, and Sarah were waiting outside Mr. Edward's office when Frank came out. He looked at them with a mix of contempt and resentment, but said nothing. He knew he had lost, and any words would change nothing. Matthew felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction as he watched Frank leave. Finally, after everything that had happened, Frank was gone. Sarah, beside him, felt liberated. She no longer had to worry about Frank's manipulations or betraying her own integrity. And though there was still much work to be done, she knew the worst obstacle had been removed. As Frank disappeared through the supermarket doors, Mr. Edward stepped out of his office, with Lauren at his side. The atmosphere was still tense, but the feeling of justice prevailed. "Thank you for coming to me with this," Mr. Edward said, looking at Matthew and Sarah with genuine gratitude. "I know it wasn't easy, but we've done the right thing. This supermarket is more than just a business. It's a community, and I won't let someone like Frank destroy what we've built." Matthew nodded, feeling that all their efforts had been worth it. "The important thing is that now we can move forward and make things better for everyone," Lauren said, her gaze full of hope for the future. "You're right," Mr. Edward said, his tone softer now. "But the work doesn't end here. We have to make sure everything Frank has done is uncovered and that we can fix any damage he's caused." Matthew and Sarah exchanged looks of relief. They knew there was much to do, but the first and hardest step had been taken. Frank had been expelled, and now the future of the supermarket seemed much brighter. The supermarket was filled with a new kind of energy. The shadow Frank had cast for years was gone, and both the employees and customers could feel it. There was a lighter atmosphere, a sense of hope that hadn't existed before. Though his departure was recent, the positive effects of his absence were already noticeable. Matthew felt different. He no longer had to worry about being manipulated or watched. For the first time since he had started working at the supermarket, he felt he could breathe easily and focus on what truly mattered: his job and the well-being of his colleagues. Since Frank had left, Matthew had taken on more responsibilities, and his relationship with Lauren had grown closer. not just professionally, but personally as well. Lauren, for her part, wasted no time in implementing some of the changes she had planned. The store needed modernization, but also a more humane approach. Her first step was to make sure all employees felt their voices were heard, something Frank had never allowed. Through weekly meetings with the staff, Lauren began to build a relationship based on trust and mutual respect. "Matthew, can you meet with me after your shift today?" Lauren asked one morning as they were organizing products on the shelves. "Sure, is it something about the business?" Matthew asked, though inside he felt a mix of curiosity and excitement about what Lauren might say. Lauren smiled but didn't give any more details. "I just want to discuss some ideas with you. See you in the office later," she said, leaving Matthew with a sense of anticipation. Meanwhile, Sarah continued adjusting to her new role in the bakery. The work was hard, but now, without Frank's pressure over her, she could focus better and enjoy her job more. Besides, the atmosphere in the supermarket had improved significantly. Her co-workers were more supportive of one another, and the support Sarah felt from Matthew and Lauren gave her a new sense of security. She had even started making small plans to improve her life outside of work. One afternoon after her shift, Sarah went to pick up Emma and Daniel. The two children were playing in the park near their home, full of energy and laughter. Seeing them like this, happy and carefree, gave her a sense of relief. Though life was still difficult, she felt they were finally moving toward a better future. "Mom, can we make a cake this weekend?" Emma asked, excited by the idea. "Of course, my love. Now that I work in the bakery, I know some new recipes we can try," Sarah replied with a smile, feeling proud to be able to offer something special to her children. That night, as she prepared dinner, Sarah reflected on how far they had come. She remembered the day she had walked into the supermarket, desperate, not knowing how she would feed her children. But now, thanks to Matthew's kindness and Lauren's support, she felt her life was taking a new direction. In the supermarket, Lauren and Matthew met in her office, where the two discussed the next steps for the business. "Matthew, I've been thinking about something," Lauren said, sitting at her desk and looking at Matthew with a serious but friendly expression. "You've shown incredible work ethic and an unwavering commitment to this store. I don't know if my father has noticed yet, but I think you should take on a new role here." Matthew looked at her, surprised. "A new role?" he asked, unsure of what she meant. "Yes, we've been reorganizing everything since Frank left, and I think you should take charge of overseeing the community program I want to implement. I want the supermarket to become a pillar for the people in the neighborhood, not just a place to shop, but a place of support for families in need like Sarah's was," Lauren explained. Matthew was silent for a moment, absorbing the proposal. He hadn't expected such an offer, but the idea of leading a project that helped families deeply excited him. "Lauren, I don't know what to say. It would be an honor. This supermarket has been my home for so long, and being able to help the community in this way is something I really care about," Matthew said, feeling a wave of gratitude. "I knew you'd say that," Lauren said with a smile. "Plus, I know this kind of project is what we need to set ourselves apart from the competition. But more than that, I want people to see this place as a refuge, a place where they can always find help." Matthew nodded, feeling more inspired than ever. "We'll start small, but I know with your leadership this can grow quickly," Lauren said confidently. As the two continued discussing the details, something new began to take shape in the store. The atmosphere of positive change was palpable, and the supermarket was no longer just a place of transactions, but a symbol of solidarity and mutual support. That same week, Lauren and Matthew organized a meeting with all the employees to announce the new community program. The reaction was positive, and many workers volunteered to help with the support initiatives for families. The idea of donating food to those in need and creating temporary employment programs for people in difficult situations resonated with everyone. Sarah also joined the initiative, helping to organize the first community events. Through her work in the bakery, she began teaching other mothers simple recipes they could make at home, sharing her knowledge and creating a network of support among the neighborhood families. The supermarket, under Lauren's direction and with Matthew's unwavering support, began to shine in a way it never had before. Sales began to rise, but more importantly, the store became a community space, a place where people found not just products, but also hope. The next day was an ordinary day in the supermarket, full of the renewed energy Lauren and Matthew had brought with their new initiatives. The families in the neighborhood were already beginning to notice the change. The bakery section, where Sarah worked with dedication, was more popular than ever, and the store's atmosphere reflected a sense of community and hope. However, that day, something unsettling was looming. Matthew was busy coordinating one of the community events, checking the details of the new support program. Everything was going according to plan. Lauren was by his side, making sure the food donations were organized for distribution that afternoon. The store seemed to have a bright future, but then an unexpected figure appeared at the supermarket's door. Frank. The employees saw him first, and a wave of murmurs quickly spread. Matthew, who was talking to one of the volunteers, felt the unease in the air and turned toward the entrance. His heart stopped for a second when he saw Frank standing at the door, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. "What is he doing here?" Matthew muttered, feeling the tension rise within him once again. Lauren saw him too, and with a mixture of surprise and anger, she headed toward the entrance, with Matthew following closely behind. Frank, despite the hostility clearly directed at him, remained calm, almost defiant. His return was no coincidence, and everyone knew it. "Frank, what are you doing here?" Lauren asked firmly, making it clear that his presence was not welcome. Frank smirked slightly, a gesture that immediately raised Matthew and Lauren's defenses. He seemed to enjoy the discomfort his arrival had caused. "Don't worry," Frank said, raising his hands as if to defuse the situation. "I'm just here to pick up a few things I left in my office. Funny how after so many years they fired me without giving me the chance to close out certain matters." Matthew stepped forward, knowing Frank wasn't just there to collect a few things. "You know your time here is over, Frank. You have no business being in this store. If you need to pick something up, you can do it with a security guard," Matthew said firmly, refusing to be intimidated. Frank looked him up and down, wearing that calculating look he'd used for years to control the store. He seemed to enjoy the confrontation. Matthew, always so obedient. Do you really think this little store can run without me?" Frank said with a dry laugh. "I know more about this business than you think, and if you think my departure was the end, you're wrong." Lauren gritted her teeth, keeping her composure despite the growing anger she felt. "I don't know what game you're playing, Frank, but the best thing you can do is leave now," Lauren said, making her stance clear. "We've done much better since you left, and we don't need your threats." Frank paused, studying their reactions, then took a step closer, enough for his presence to feel intimidating. Employees watched from a distance, unsure of how to act, but the tension was palpable, and it was clear things were about to escalate. "Better?" Frank repeated mockingly. "We'll see about that, because while you may think you got rid of me easily, I still have a few cards up my sleeve. Or do you think I don't know how things really work around here? I could bring down everything you're building with just one call?" Matthew felt a surge of frustration, but Lauren stopped him before he could act impulsively. "Frank, if you have any legal issues or claims, you can go through the proper channels. This is a serious business, and if you keep interfering, we'll take steps to ensure you don't come near this place again," Lauren said, looking him directly in the eye without fear. For a moment, Frank seemed to consider what Lauren was saying. He knew he no longer had the influence he once did, but he wasn't someone who accepted defeat easily. "It's up to you, Lauren. Either you give me what I'm owed, or I can make sure this supermarket and your reputation suffer the consequences," Frank said, his tone now threatening and direct. "Don't underestimate me." Lauren stood her ground, though inside she knew Frank might have some hidden trick up his sleeve. He had always been a manipulator, and even though they had kicked him out, there was a possibility he had done something before leaving. "We're not afraid of you, Frank. If you've done something illegal, you'd better face the consequences. Now leave before we have to call the authorities," Lauren said, keeping her composure. Frank stared at her, studying her face for a few more seconds, then let out a low laugh. Fine, he finally said, stepping back. "I'll leave, for now, but don't think this is over. I'll be back when you least expect it." With those words, Frank turned on his heel and walked out of the supermarket, his shadow fading into the street. Matthew and Lauren stood there watching him leave, knowing that, although he had left, the threat still lingered over them. Matthew, still feeling the adrenaline from the moment, looked at Lauren. "What do you think he's going to do?" he asked, worried about possible retaliation. Lauren took a deep breath and crossed her arms. "I don't know, but we're not going to let his threats stop us. We knew he might try something, but if he's done something illegal, we'll face it," she said with determination. "I'm going to talk to my father. Frank doesn't have access to anything important, but we need to make sure everything is under control. If he has any tricks up his sleeve, we're going to find them." Matthew nodded, knowing Lauren was right. Despite Frank's threat, they couldn't let themselves be intimidated. The supermarket was at a crucial moment, and they couldn't allow someone like him to destroy what they had achieved. After Frank's unexpected appearance, the sense of peace that Matthew, Lauren, and Sarah had built around the supermarket began to crumble. Even though Frank had left with a barely concealed threat, Lauren and Matthew knew they couldn't afford to ignore what he had said. Frank had always been cunning, and if he had left any traps before being fired, they had to find them before he could use them against them. Later that afternoon, Lauren met with her father, Mr. Edward, in his office. There was an air of urgency to the conversation. "Dad, Frank was here today," Lauren said, concerned. "He came to threaten us, saying he has something that could hurt us. I think he left something behind before he was fired." Mr. Edward frowned at the news. Although he trusted his daughter, the idea that Frank, someone he had relied on for so many years, could have manipulated something without him noticing, enraged him. "I knew Frank was clever, but I never imagined he would go this far," Mr. Edward responded. "If he left something, we'll find it. I want to go through all the files, accounts, and any operations Frank handled in his last months. We need to make sure he didn't do anything that could compromise the store's stability," Lauren said with determination. "Do whatever you think is necessary, daughter. I don't want anything we've built to be destroyed by his actions," Mr. Edward replied, giving her his full support. Matthew and Sarah joined Lauren in the task of reviewing documents, records, and financial accounts. The atmosphere was tense, but they all knew they couldn't stop until they were sure there were no traces of Frank left that could threaten the business. Sarah, who had been helping to review the older files, came across a folder labeled Special Projects. Though the title didn't seem alarming, something in her intuition told her there might be more to it than it seemed. "Matthew, come take a look at this," Sarah said, holding up the folder. Matthew came over and together they began to go through the documents inside. What they found was disturbing. Frank had been siphoning small amounts of money through a fictitious project that had never been implemented. The sums weren't large enough to be easily noticed, but over time, the money had disappeared without explanation. Additionally, it seemed he had been using fake suppliers to justify the transactions. "Here it is. This is what Frank was hiding," Matthew said, pointing to the suspicious transactions. "He's been stealing money for months, maybe years, but he did it so carefully that it almost went unnoticed." Hearing this, Lauren quickly came over and reviewed the documents. Anger filled her as she realized the magnitude of what Frank had done. "This is bigger than we thought. He wasn't just manipulating the employees, he was stealing from the store." "My father needs to see this immediately," Lauren said, gathering the documents to show Mr. Edward. That same afternoon, Mr. Edward, Lauren, Matthew, and Sarah gathered in the supermarket's main office. Mr. Edward examined the documents carefully, his expression darkening as he read through them. "I can't believe this was happening right under our noses," he said, frowning. "Frank has been stealing from us for a long time. This is a serious crime. The worst part is that Frank must know we're close to uncovering it. That's why he came back. He wanted to warn us that he has hidden cards, and now we know what they are," Lauren added. "What do we do?" Matthew asked, aware they needed to act quickly. Mr. Edward made a swift and firm decision. "We'll press charges. Frank has committed fraud, and he must pay for what he's done. This supermarket is my life, and I won't let a man like him destroy what we've worked so hard to build. Lauren, I want you to contact our lawyers. We're going to take legal action immediately." Lauren nodded, relieved that her father was taking control of the situation. They knew that suing Frank wouldn't be easy, but with the evidence they had found, there was a strong chance Frank would face the consequences of his actions. "We also need to make sure everything is in order at the store," Mr. Edward added. "We don't know if Frank left anything else hidden. I want you to check every corner of the business to be completely sure there are no more surprises." In the following days, Lauren, Matthew, and Sarah, along with other trusted employees, meticulously reviewed all the supermarket's operations. They found more irregularities, but nothing as severe as what they had discovered in the Special Projects folder. It seemed Frank had been taking advantage of his position to slowly siphon off money, but his scheme had come to an end. As the legal preparations moved forward, the supermarket continued to operate, and the atmosphere began to stabilize once again. The community continued to support the new initiatives led by Lauren and Matthew, and sales kept improving. However, Frank's threat still loomed over them, like a shadow that wouldn't easily fade. One afternoon, as Sarah was finishing her shift at the bakery, she received an unexpected call. Seeing the number on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was an unknown number, but something inside her told her she should answer it. "Hello," Sarah said cautiously. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Hello, Sarah. I suppose they've already told you that I was fired from that damn store, but that doesn't mean it's over," Frank said, his tone cold and threatening. "If you think you can stay there in peace, you're very wrong. I always have a plan." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Frank was dangerous, but she hadn't expected him to contact her directly. "You have nothing to do here, Frank. What you did has been uncovered, and you're going to pay for it," Sarah responded, trying to stay calm. "Do you really think I'm finished?" Frank laughed derisively. "There are many things you don't know. This isn't over, Sarah, and when you least expect it, everything you've built will come crashing down." The call ended, leaving her with a sense of unease and fear. Sarah knew she had to tell Matthew and Lauren what had happened, but deep down, she felt that the fight against Frank was far from over. Sarah hung up the phone, Frank's chilling voice still echoing in her mind. His threat had unsettled her, and although she knew he no longer had direct control over the supermarket, the possibility that he had something else planned filled her with fear. She couldn't stay silent. She had to tell Matthew and Lauren what had happened, but she also felt that Frank might have something hidden that could put them all in danger. That same night, after the supermarket had closed, Sarah met with Matthew at his apartment. She couldn't wait until the next morning. The matter was too serious. "Matthew, I need to tell you something," Sarah said, as she entered the small room, her face filled with worry. Matthew, seeing her expression, immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, his tone now urgent. "Frank called me," Sarah said bluntly. "He threatened me, Matthew. He said this isn't over, and that he still has a plan to destroy everything we've built." Matthew felt a mix of anger and concern. He knew Frank was a threat, but he hadn't expected him to go so far as to personally harass Sarah. He stood up, pacing the small room, trying to stay calm. "What else did he say?" he asked, trying to figure out what they could do to protect themselves. "He just hinted that he has something hidden, something that could hurt us." "He said that when we least expect it, everything will come crashing down," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she recalled Frank's threatening words. Matthew stopped pacing and approached Sarah, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We're going to be okay, Sarah. I won't let Frank harm you or your family." "He can't keep intimidating us like this," Matthew said firmly. "We have the evidence of his fraud, and we're going to face him in court. But we also need to be prepared in case he tries something else." "Do you think he can do something?" Sarah asked, still feeling the fear in her chest. "Frank is cunning, but he doesn't have the power he used to have. What he's doing now is trying to scare us into making a mistake. We can't let him intimidate us," Matthew responded, determined. The next morning, Matthew and Lauren met in Mr. Edwards' office to discuss what had happened. Lauren listened carefully as Sarah told her about Frank's call, and though concern showed on her face, she remained calm. "We expected this," Lauren finally said. "We knew Frank wouldn't stay quiet after everything that's happened, but now that he's directly threatened Sarah, we have enough reason to involve the authorities." Mr. Edward, who had been silent during the conversation, nodded gravely. "I'm going to talk to our lawyer. Frank can't continue harassing this store's employees, and if he's committed a crime by stalking her, we'll sue him for that too," he said firmly. However, Lauren knew that the matter wouldn't be resolved quickly. Frank still held power that wasn't just based on legal matters. He knew the business inside out, the vulnerabilities of the store, and the weaknesses of the people who had worked with him. "We need to be ready for anything, Matthew," Lauren said. "We don't know if Frank left something else hidden. We need to make sure there are no more traps that could harm us." Matthew nodded, knowing the work was far from over. Despite the threats, they had to continue reviewing everything Frank had touched during his time as manager. They knew he had been careful and meticulous in his actions, and it was possible he had left some hidden trap within the store's operations. Meanwhile, Sarah tried to stay calm and focus on her job in the bakery, but Frank's words echoed in her mind. Though Matthew and Lauren had assured her they were taking the necessary steps, the fear remained. She felt watched, as if Frank was lurking around every corner, waiting for the right moment to strike again. A week after Frank's call, the supermarket's accounting team discovered something disturbing. Going through some of the older accounts that Frank had managed, they found a series of transactions related to non-existent suppliers. Although they had already uncovered some of these irregularities, this time the discovery was bigger. "Matthew, Lauren, you need to see this," said one of the accountants, approaching them with a file in hand. Frank created accounts for suppliers that never existed. He was funneling money into an external account we hadn't detected before. Matthew and Lauren reviewed the documents carefully, feeling that they had found something important. "This is enough to destroy any defense Frank might have in court," Lauren said, clearly satisfied. "But we need to act quickly before he realizes we've found this." "I'll speak to our lawyer immediately," Mr. Edward, who had been informed of the discovery, said. Despite the success in uncovering Frank's schemes, a sense of danger still lingered. Everyone knew Frank wouldn't give up easily. The threats he had made to Sarah and his calculated behavior indicated that he had something else planned. A few days later, Sarah received an anonymous letter at her home. When she opened it, the handwritten message sent chills down her spine. "Don't think you've won, this isn't over. When everything falls apart, you'll remember this warning." Sarah felt the ground fall away from under her. She called Matthew immediately, and he rushed to her house as fast as he could. When he arrived, he found Sarah visibly shaken, clutching the letter in her hands. "Another threat?" Matthew asked, already knowing the answer, before Sarah nodded. "Yes, and this time it's more direct. I don't know what to do, Matthew." "I feel like Frank is closer than we think," Sarah said, fear reflected in her eyes. Matthew read the letter and felt a surge of anger. He knew this went beyond simple intimidation. Frank was playing a dangerous game, and now they were in his crosshairs. "We're going to take this very seriously," Matthew said, his voice filled with determination. "Frank won't get away with this, but we can't allow him to keep threatening you like this. We'll talk to the authorities. This isn't just a legal issue anymore, it's a matter of safety for all of us." The days following the arrival of the anonymous letter were tense. The atmosphere in the supermarket, once full of hope and renewal, was now filled with uncertainty. Every time someone entered or left the store, the glances between Matthew, Lauren, and Sarah were filled with nervousness, as if they expected Frank to show up at any moment to unleash his revenge. Mr. Edward, meanwhile, had remained firm, moving forward with the lawyers to bring Frank to justice for fraud and harassment. He knew they had enough to ensure Frank faced serious consequences, but he also understood the cunning of his former manager. That man had a history of manipulating situations to his advantage, and deep down, everyone knew the fight wasn't over. Sarah, for her part, struggled against the fear that gripped her every night. The sound of Frank's voice on the phone, the threatening words he had left in that last call, echoed in her head over and over again. She wasn't sleeping well, and though Matthew and Lauren supported her, the shadow of what could happen followed her everywhere. One afternoon, while Sarah was placing freshly baked bread on the shelves in the bakery, her phone buzzed in her pocket. The simple sound made her heart race. She hesitated before pulling it out, fearing it was another message from Frank. But this time it was different. It was a message from Matthew. "Sarah, come to the office as soon as you can. We found something important. Matthew." Sarah's heart raced faster. She wiped her hands and hurried toward the office. When she arrived, she found Matthew and Lauren huddled around a computer, both wearing intense expressions. As soon as they saw her, Matthew turned with a mix of excitement and concern. "We found something, Sarah," Matthew said, his voice barely containing the urgency. "This could be what finally takes Frank down." "What did you find?" she asked, feeling the tension in her chest increase. "Going through the old supplier files, we found something that had gone unnoticed until now," Lauren said, pointing to the screen. Frank created a system of false invoices using the names of suppliers that never existed. It was all hidden in files that seemed harmless, but now we have proof that he's been funneling money into fake accounts for years. Sarah stepped closer and looked at the documents on the screen. The details were overwhelming. Fake invoices, unknown bank accounts, sums of money that had disappeared into the hands of someone who, until recently, had been a pillar of the supermarket. The gravity of what Frank had done was finally coming to light. "This is incredible," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Is it enough to stop him?" Lauren nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "This will destroy him, Sarah. Frank can't explain away all this missing money. And the best part is that it's all documented. He has no escape." Matthew took Sarah's hand, offering her a gesture of support. "We've won this battle, Sarah. Frank can't hurt us anymore." Without wasting time, they took the evidence straight to the lawyers. The legal team worked tirelessly for hours to build a solid case. The counterclaim Frank had filed in a desperate attempt to stay in control was completely dismantled with this new evidence. His entire plan to manipulate the system was falling apart. The day of the trial arrived with a mixture of nerves and hope. Sarah, Matthew, Lauren, and Mr. Edward sat in the courtroom, watching as the case unfolded before them. Every document, every fraudulent transaction Frank had made, was presented before the judge. The evidence was so overwhelming that even Frank's lawyer struggled to defend him. Frank, sitting on the other side of the courtroom, maintained a cold expression, but the tension in his jaw revealed that he knew he was losing. Sarah couldn't stop looking at him, remembering all the nights of fear and anxiety he had caused her. But as the trial progressed, something changed inside her. The fear began to disappear, replaced by a sense of relief and justice. Finally, Frank was getting what he deserved. The judge didn't take long to make a decision. With the evidence in hand, he ruled that Frank was guilty of fraud, financial manipulation, and harassment. He was ordered to repay every penny he had stolen, in addition to facing legal penalties that would leave him marked for life. His reputation, his career, everything he had built on deceit, had crumbled in a matter of hours. As the verdict was read, a deep sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes, but this time they were of relief, of a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Lauren hugged her, while Mr. Edward nodded with pride. They had won. "This is just the beginning, Sarah," Matthew said with a warm smile. "Now we can start fresh, without Frank, without fear." However, they knew Frank wouldn't accept defeat easily. After the trial, as everyone left the courtroom, Sarah received one last call from Frank. "Congratulations, Sarah. It seems you won in court, but I warn you, this isn't over." "I'm not the kind of man who gives up easily," he said, his usual tone of disdain present. Sarah, who had lived in terror of that voice for so long, felt no fear this time. Instead, she felt something completely different. Power. "You don't scare me anymore, Frank," Sarah responded firmly. "This is over for you. We're moving on. And you stay in the past." Frank laughed, but this time his laugh sounded hollow, lacking the confidence it once had. "We'll see, Sarah, we'll see," he replied, and then hung up. Sarah looked at her phone and took a deep breath. She knew Frank might still try to intimidate her, but he no longer had any power over her. That dark chapter of her life had finally come to an end. With Frank out of their lives, the supermarket flourished under the new leadership of Lauren and Matthew. Community initiatives grew exponentially, and the business became a pillar of support for local families. Sarah, finally free from fear, focused on her work and her children, feeling she had found a new stability. Every time Sarah walked through the store's aisles, she saw employees smiling, customers happy, and the sense of community they had built. What had once been a place of tension and manipulation was now a symbol of hope, unity, and growth. Matthew, now with a more significant role in managing the supermarket, continued to support Sarah every step of the way. Together they knew the worst was behind them, and for the first time in a long time, the future looked full of possibilities. Although Frank remained somewhere filled with resentment and bitterness, they no longer cared. They had won the most important battle, the one for reclaiming their lives and their peace. And with that victory, the supermarket and everyone who was part of it looked ahead, ready for whatever came next. The story reflects the transformative power of kindness and justice amidst adversity. A simple act of compassion from Matthew towards Sarah triggers a chain of events that exposes Frank's corruption and strengthens the community. Through the struggles of the main characters, we see how integrity, unity, and perseverance triumph over manipulation and fear. The story teaches us that even small gestures can have a profound impact, and that when people support one another, they can overcome any obstacle. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new content. See you in the next one.